Hey there, this is Justin with Lesser Dog Tutorials, and welcome to part 6 in the 2D point-and-click adventure game tutorial series for Unreal. This is the first part of the inventory section, and before we get started, let's look at some issues that we have currently in our game. So if we use an action on something like a hotspot, and then we are standing in the right position and we use another action, the walk to doesn't get cleared, and then if we walk from there, our animation continues moving, and if you were to use a verb on something and then click another verb, he stops moving but he runs still. It's just a whole mess of things that need to be fixed. So let's address these now. Go ahead and open your adventure character blueprint, and in the event graph we're going to kind of fix up some stuff. So we'll add a custom event here under the event tick area, and we'll call it reset idle. And we'll just connect it to this little reroute node here, because we're going to need to specifically fire that reset on our own. So in the adventure controller, open up the interrupt action function. And right at the end, right before we call that interrupting action dispatcher, we're going to add the player controller, and from that fire that reset idle event that we made. And then next we'll want to open the widget blueprint for the verbs, and in there, in the clear current path area, we're just going to delete that function, and we're going to instead add an interrupt function node. Next, right before the interrupt action function, we'll want to add a reference to the player character, and then pull out from that, and we're going to do the set override facing direction, and we're going to keep it false. Next, we're going to go back to the adventure controller, and we're going to reconfigure the left mouse button area. So we can just delete the two clear current path functions, and we might as well delete that interrupt action function as well. Then we can connect everything back up like those functions never existed. And then inside the get clicked macro, we'll select the cast and the get hit result and the set target hotspot, and we'll just make that a new macro that we're going to call assign target hotspot, because we're going to reuse this. So if you open that, we're going to clean it up a smidge, and we'll change the top output to success, the bottom output to failed, and reconnect the target hotspot to the success and the cast failed to the failed output. Now we can compile and save that. And then back in the get clicked, we're going to disconnect those connections there, and we're going to duplicate the assign target hotspot. And then we're going to drag in the interrupt action function and put that right before the top assign target hotspot. So it's on the true chain of that branch. And then the failed on the bottom assign target hotspot and the success can both go to the output. And then the failed also, the top one, will go connect to the failed line on the bottom. But the success on the top will instead go to call update interaction text before continuing on the success line. Next, we're going to move everything over and disconnect this branch node and drag in the get hotspot interaction bool, and we're going to branch from that, and that will connect up to the false branch output pin. Now, if this is true, it will go up to the interrupt action, and if it's false, it will go to the bottom row. Next, we want to take that interrupt action, and we're going to just tack it on the end on the bottom here. And that should be all we're doing in this macro, so you can compile and save. Now, let's look at the mouse enter hotspot function. So if we're not performing a task interaction or doing a hotspot interaction, then we set the target hotspot and we call the update interaction text. However, if we're already performing some interaction and we mouse over another hotspot, maybe we should save that reference in case we want to interact with it, which would in turn interrupt our current interaction and perform the new one. So let's create another hotspot variable, and then we'll just call this new hotspot, and we'll set this if the branch is true. And it's going to be the same hotspot that is being passed through the function. But we don't need to move on from this. We're just saving the reference. Now, let's move over to the mouse exit hotspot. And the false section of this branch is going to reset both target hotspot and new hotspot. But the difference is if it's true, it's only going to reset the new hotspot and not touch the target hotspot. Now head over to the walk to hotspot macro, and we're going to delete the current path. We're going to delete the variable and everything because we're just changing stuff around willy-nilly. And so you can see that in both walk to hotspot and walk to location, there's no more current path reference. We can also delete the clear current path function. We're not going to use that anymore. Essentially, I'm changing again how the player moves. So in the walk to hotspot, we can delete the move to location or actor node, delete that call begin action, delete the get AI controller, and we're just going to leave the player character. And then we're going to add an AI move to node, hook up the player character to the pawn, the make vector return value to the destination, and then an on success output will go to the output of the macro itself. Now the acceptance radius, I want to create a variable for that. So let's make a new variable called acceptance radius, change it to a float, and then we'll use that float and hook that up to the acceptance radius input, and we'll set the default value to 1. Then, over in the walk to location, do the same thing, bring in the AI move to, make sure that you hook it up to the false output on the branch, and then select the output, and then we can just delete that output pin, we don't need that. Delete the get AI controller, hook the player character up to the pawn, and the return value of the make vector to the destination, and acceptance radius to the acceptance radius. Cool. You can save and compile that. Next, we're going to open up the perform interaction macro, and we'll remove the output pin. We don't need that. Clean up the on walk to section. And you can see now our event graph is looking a little more clean and sleek. So let's open up the walk to hotspot. And right at the beginning, we're going to call the begin action event dispatcher. Cool. Now, if we test it out, we can use the poster and walk away and interrupt. We can push the poster, or we can push the door and then walk to the poster and interrupt it, and it will clear. And then we walk down here, it'll clear. We can push the poster and press another button. Essentially, you're going to be hard-pressed to, I think, find any sort of errors or problems with this. So I think we can move on. If you'll notice, whenever we use the door and we come back out to this main room, the camera kind of slides over. Watch, you'll see it again. You leave and it slides over. Well, let's fix that. Over in the BP Adventure Cam Blueprint, head over to the Activate Camera function that we didn't use at all for some reason. Or maybe you don't even have one. I'm not really sure where it came from. Just make sure you have a function called Activate Camera with no inputs. And then in that, we're going to get the adventure character. And then we're going to set the player variable. And then we're going to get the set view target with blend node. And you'll have to turn off context sensitive in order to find that. And we'll want to get the player controller, which will be passed into the target. And then for the new view target, we can just add a reference to self. And you can compile and save that. And then back in the event graph, we'll run that after we get the camera confines in the event begin play. And you know what? This actually doesn't need to be a function. So just select all of the nodes and we'll make a macro that we're going to call activate cam. And you can delete the activate camera. We don't need that anymore. We can just paste these nodes in here. That way, you can only access this function in this blueprint and not in external sources. That way, we can keep it a little more clean. Next, you'll want to go back to the event graph and delete that old function and replace it with this macro. Sweet. All right, now let's go to the adventure library. And we don't need this activate current camera function anymore, so you can delete that. And back in the adventure instance, you'll see these nodes now are missing, so you can delete them and hook up the load stream level at the top with the find door. And then at the bottom, we'll just move the delay until after find door and hook that up to the hide black screen node. And you can compile and save that. And actually, we want to, I think, after the find door and the top, we'll add a little bit of a delay, maybe 0.25. And it'll give the camera time to get into position. And then we'll just show the black screen right at the beginning, just in case. And the last thing we'll do is head over to the adventure character and delete the assign room camera function. We don't need that anymore either. So if we play, now the camera will assign when the player enters the room without needing to explicitly say assign the camera. And then also the camera will get to the position it needs to be while the black screen is active, so it essentially will hide that. Next, we're going to do a little bit of cleanup in the hotspot. So open that up, and in the wait function, that hasn't been assigned yet. So drag in the player controller, and from that we'll do task wait. And then what we want to do is pass in the amount of time as opposed to using a variable. So add an input on the adventure controller's task wait event and make it a float, and we'll just call it wait time. And you can hook the delay up right to that wait time, and we can delete the variable. We won't be using it anymore. So back in the hotspot, again, we want to pass in through the function. We want to pass in the wait time again and hook that up. And then in the hotspot event graph, we will be dragging in the wait. And you can see that you can place that anywhere you want and type in the time, and it'll pass through all the way to the delay and then increment the task index. So we're good there. So now on the other tasks, we can remove these variables like facing direction and bark text. We don't need to set these. We can pass them through events. So if you go to the hotspot and you open these functions, you can see that we're setting these variables. You can just delete them. We don't need to do that. But we do want to add the inputs to the task events so that we can pass them directly through. So just make the facing direction with the enum facing direction on the task face direction. And then for the bark, we add that string variable, and we'll just call it, bark text or whatever you want, and pass that through. And then delete the variables in the hotspot functions and just make sure you're passing the variable right through. And then we want to make sure that the variables in the adventure controller are deleted. And also make sure that in the face hotspot, the variable is not being set in there either. All right, now we can finally move towards the inventory stuff that I promised. So in the textures folder, create a folder called items and then create another one called player. And we'll just move all the player stuff in there. And then in the items, we want to drag in the pickle image, which can be found in the zip file in the description of this video. And then of course we want to do the sprite actions, apply the paper 2D settings, and then we'll right click again, go to sprite actions and create a sprite. And if you open the sprite up, you can see that that's what we'll be working with for our inventory. And then in the zip file also is the temp guide pickup. And what we'll do is we'll do the paper 2D settings, but then when we extract the sprites, switch it from auto to grid, because we're going to custom make the grid here. And for the cell width, we're going to do 32 and keep the height at 64 and hit extract. Now we need to open each one and do a little bit of tweaking. So open the first one, and for the pivot mode, which is at the bottom of this area here, select custom, and then for the custom pivot point, do 17 for X, and then do 35 for Y, and save that. And then open up the next one. Do the same thing, custom pivot mode, but for X, we're going to do 49, and then Y will be 35 again. And then for the last one, we're going to do the custom pivot mode again, but for X, we're going to do 81, and for Y, we'll do 35 too. Now select all three of these images and right-click and create a flipbook, and then we can just drag that into our flipbooks folder, but make sure that it's in the player folder within the flipbooks folder. And then we can rename it And for our purposes, we'll just name it temp guy underscore pickup right. And then if you open that up, we can change a couple things in here. For the frames per second, let's change it from 15 to 6. And then extend the third image to about 3 frames so it holds on that just a smidge. And then you can save that and close all of these tabs. Now in the adventure character, we're going to add a new flipbook variable that we'll just call pickup right and change that to a flipbook. And then move it into the flipbooks category and then set the pickup right default value to our new flipbook. And then in the set animation state, we need to add an other entry to this enum. So head over to the enumerations and open the current anim state and just add a new one at the bottom here. And we'll just call that pickup right and save that. And now in the adventure character, you'll see that the new one's there, so we can drag in the variable, hook that up, and then we can compile and save that. Now in the event graph, we can add a new macro called animation sequence. And what this is going to do is run whatever animation we want and tell us when the animation is complete. So make sure that the in and out exec pins exist, and then drag in the current animation state. And what we need to do is add a new variable called temp animation state and make that of a type current anim state. And then we're going to set that right at the beginning. And what we're doing is saving whatever the current animation state is so that we can go back to it after we play the animation that we're playing. So in the input, we're going to add another one. And of course, it's going to be the animation state enumeration. And then we'll want to set the animation state to this animation that we're passing in. Next, we want to add a delay node. And what this is going to do is wait a certain amount of time, or however long the animation is, before switching back to the previous animation state. So for instance, if our player is standing there idle, we run the pickup animation, and then when it's complete, we switch back to the idle animation from before. So if you drag in the pickup right flipbook, and from that get the total duration, we now have a float that tells us how long the animation runs. So the delay can run the duration of this new animation, and then we set the animation state back to idle or whatever it was before we ran the pickup animation. And then if you compile and save, we are done with that, but we still need a better solution for this temporary pickup right. We want to be able to throw in any animation in here and have it wait the duration of that animation. So over in the set animation state, we can select the entire select node as well as all the animations, right click and hit collapse to macro. And we can name that get animation flipbook. And the reason I'm doing this is because we also want to use this again in the animation sequence macro, but it would be even better if we could just pass in an animation state, and it doesn't always have to rely on whatever the current animation state is. So if you open the get animation flipbook, we can just add an input of a type current anim state and just pass that to the index. And now we can determine which flipbook to use based on whatever we pass in. So for instance, in the set animation state, we could pass in the current animation state. And then in the animation sequence, we can just pass in the animation state from the input. There. Now, depending on whatever animation we pass in, it will play the correct animation and wait the correct amount of time. Hopefully I've said animation state enough. Now that that's done, we can head to the event graph and create a custom event that we're going to call play animation. And from that, we will run the animation sequence. And then we'll add the input for the animation state on that event. I guess I haven't said animation state enough. And then after the animation sequence, we'll increment the task index. and then we'll get the adventure controller to link up to that. And while we're at it, we can use this get adventure controller up in the bark delay instead of casting like before. Now head over to the adventure controller, and on the event graph, we can add another task, and this will be a custom event, and we'll call it task play animation. And then we'll drag in the player character variable, and from there we'll do the play animation event. And then we'll add an input, animation state input, to the task play animation, call it animation, and just hook that up. And then we'll want to increment the task index. However, it already increments on the adventure character, so we can just add that comment there. Now let's test it out. So in the Hotspot poster, we'll override the pickup function. And we could just copy the switch node up there and put that here. And we'll run a little sequence by starting the begin task interaction and doing the face hotspot node. However, for the picking up an item, we actually need to add a function in the hotspot blueprint itself that we can call here. So open the hotspot blueprint, add a function that we'll call play animation. And we'll add an input of the current anim state again. We'll just call it animation. And what this is going to do is run the animation, the task play animation event on the player controller. And we'll pass in the animation to that. Now back over in the poster hotspot, we'll run the play animation function on number 2 and switch the animation to pick up right. And then let's delete the last 2 pins. And then if you go to the end task interaction, you'll see that what it does is it sets the task index to 0, is performing interaction to false, and then it runs interrupt action. But what we want to do is not interrupt the action. We just want to set task index to 0 and is performing task interaction to false, because we still want to run some things, but we don't want to lock the sequence in place. So in the hotspot, let's create a new function called interrupt task interaction, drag in the player controller, and then we'll set the task index to 0, and then set is performing task interaction to false. Because now we can actually stop the task interaction sequence, but continue to do events that we want to do. Hopefully it'll make sense when we actually play, and I'll show you. So on default, we'll do interrupt task interaction, so now the character is free to move. And then we'll print the string that we've added the pickle to our inventory, because we haven't figured out this yet. And after that, we will bark, and he'll say something like, "There's a pickle behind this poster." And then after that, we will clear the verb. And we do this on the event graph of the hotspot. You can see at the end there. So this will reset, the description text and all that. Cool. Let's test it out and see, and I'll show you what I'm doing here. So if you hit play and we pick up the poster, he'll walk over, he can't move, he'll pick it up, and now you're free to move, right? The character says something and you're free to move around while that happens. So it's just like the old point and click games. Next, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the inventory. We're going to go to the enums folder. I'm going to add a new enumeration that we're going to call enum_item list. In here, we're going to have a list of every item that you'll find in your game. So add a new entry and name it none, and then add another entry and name this one pickle with a lowercase p. Next, we're going to go to the blueprints folder, and we'll add a new folder that we'll call inventory. And in this folder, we're going to add a blueprint class. And we're going to select object in the dropdown of all classes just select the base object and name this BP underscore item. Now we're going to add a structure under blueprints, and we're going to name this st underscore item data. If we open up that structure, what we'll want to add is just 2 entries. The first one will be of the type enumeration item list that we just made, and we'll just call this item. And then we'll add a new variable, and we'll make this a type BP item. However, we're going to select a class reference, not the object reference. And then we'll name this class. And then in the drop down at the bottom, we can just set this to BP item, even though this will change depending on what item we make. Next, we're going to right click, and under miscellaneous, we're going to add a data table. Now in the drop down, we can select the st item data that we just made, and we'll name this dt underscore item list. And if we open that up, we'll add an entry, and in the drop down at the bottom, we'll select pickle. And then for class, we don't have a pickle item yet, so let's make that. Back in the inventory folder, we're going to make another folder that we'll call items. And in this folder, we'll create a blueprint class based off of BP item. And then we'll name this BP underscore item underscore pickle. Now back in the data table, we can select BP item pickle in that class dropdown, and then make sure to right click the row and hit rename, and rename it to the same spelling as the enumeration entry, so lowercase pickle. Now open the BP item blueprint, and what we're going to do in here is first select the class settings, and over in the interfaces section, we're going to implement the verb interaction interface. So over on the left side, you'll see all of the functions that we have in the verb interface. However, I think we want to add one more. So go over to the blueprints folder and go into interfaces and open the interface. And in here, we're going to add another function that we're going to call onItemUsed. So what we're going to do with this is add a single input of the type item list enumeration, and we'll just name this item, and you can compile and save this. And then if you compile the BP item blueprint, you'll see that it will pop up, and then you can just implement each of these events. Now, if you were to right click in the event graph and try to find the adventure controller, you can see that it does not have that option. This is because it is an object type, and its parent class is an object, so that means it doesn't inherit from actor, so it doesn't have like tick and a bunch of other things. So what we want to do is just create a variable of the adventure controller, and we will assign this later. But for now, we can still do everything that we need using this variable. It just won't work until we pass in and assign the adventure controller later. So when we start deciding what these functions do, we can skip the event on walk to because it's an item in your inventory. You don't walk to it. So drag in the adventure controller for the event on pull and drag out from that, and we're going to look for task bark. And all we're going to do is just fill in some placeholder text. So you could say something like, I can't pull that, or whatever humorous thing you want your game to do. After the task bark, we're going to do the interrupt action event. And those both come from the adventure controller. And we're going to probably want to do this for each of these events. So what we could do is just select all of these nodes and things and just right click, and we'll collapse to a macro. And we can call that macro item bark. And then what we can do is add an input of the type string so that we can just pass in bark text from the event graph so that we can make each verb say something different. Now that that's complete, we can actually put the bark text in here instead. And we can do the same for each of these, and it would just be the default thing that your character would say for an item that does not interact with a specific verb. For instance, on event on pickup, you could say I already have that. And for on give, we're actually not going to have anything for that because that's logic to figure out later. So we can just throw a comment on there to say logic to come or something like that. Just fill out and hook up the rest of them up until you get to on use. This one will have another comment where we just say logic is to come. And then for the push, it could just be, I can't push that. Something simple. Now on the event walk to, what we're going to do is just add a reroute note and a comment that just says won't do anything, because this was just going to use the lookout logic and will never really walk to anything. Now for the event on item used, what we want to do is create a variable that's going to be called interactable item, and this is going to be of the type enum item list. And this is a variable that we will set later if an item is able to be interacted with another item. And if we set this to a specific item and the item we're passing in matches this, then we'll know that it is something that we actually use. Additionally to checking if it's equal to the item we pass through, we also want to check to make sure that it's not equal to none. Because if it is equal to none, it very well could match, and we don't want it to fire any sort of function if that's the case. So now that we have the check in place, we need to create a function that can be overridden in other items so that we can assign different actions and tasks and things depending on if it's a success. So I'm going to create a function that I'm going to call item combine success. And this is just for now going to do a print string where I'll just say success. Then I'm going to make another function called item combine fail. And what this one will do will be pass in a string, and then it will run the item bark macro. And I can compile and save that. And on the event graph, I'll just drag both of these in, and the fail will go to the false of the branch. And for the text, I'll just say that won't work. And then the item combine success goes to the true part of the branch. And then down at the bottom, make sure you connect up the event on pickup. I forgot that earlier. And then we'll add a variable called thumbnail, and that will be of the type paper sprite. And then we'll add one more variable called name, and that will be of the type string. And then we can compile and save, and that is all we need to do in here. So now, open up the BP item pickle blueprint, and in the class defaults, we're not going to choose an interactable item, but we are going to choose the pickle sprite as the thumbnail, and the name will be pickle, and this is the name that you will see in the interaction text. And then you can close both of these. Next, in the widgets folder, we're going to create a new widget blueprint that we'll call WBP underscore item slot. And then if you open that up, there are a few things we need to do. First, drag a button onto the canvas panel, and then drag an image onto the button. You can rename the image to item slot and rename the button to item button. Then we're going to wrap the item button with a size box, and then right-click the canvas panel and replace with child. Next, select the size box, and we're going to tick the width and height override, and set the width to 38 and height to 22. Next, we're going to select the item slot and have it horizontally and vertically align fill. And then we're going to change the top right fill screen to desired. Then we'll select the item button. And for each of the styles for normal, hovered, and pressed, we're going to change the draw as to none instead of box. Now, if you collapse these styles, you can see under them we have the padding for normal and pressed. Set those to 0, and if you hit compile, it'll refresh. Now over in the graph, we're going to add a few variables, and the first one is going to be a bool called hasItem, And the next variable is going to be called inventory item. And this will be of a type BP item. Next, we're going to create a function called add item. And the first thing this is going to do is set the hasItem bool to true. Next, we're going to set the inventory item by passing in a BP item parameter through the input node. Next, we're going to drag in the item slot reference, and from that, we're going to set brush. And then if you right-click the struct, you can expand it, and then from the item to add, you can get the thumbnail, and from the thumbnail, it can go directly into the in-brush image input pin. Next, from the item slot, we're going to set the visibility to visible, and we can clean up the lines by adding a couple reroute nodes. Next, we're going to create another function called remove item. And if we revisit the add item function, we can actually grab a few of the nodes, the set brush, visibility, item slot, and these two variable sets, and copy them and paste them. So we're just going to set the inverse. So hasItem to false, set no inventory item, set no brush image, and visibility to hidden. Now back in the event graph, we can delete everything except for the event construct. And the first node will be a branch that determines whether or not hasItem is true. And then we're going to drag out the item slot and set the visibility to hidden if it's false. Now we can grab the item button and add the onReleased event. I like to use onReleased. You can also use onClicked. And then we'll add the onHovered and onUnhovered events. Then we can copy and paste the hasItem branch and put it at the beginning of the onReleased event. And if it's true, then that means an item has been clicked. So we'll just put a comment right now that says item clicked, and we'll figure that out in a bit. If it's false, then we want to get the adventure controller and interrupt the action. So that means if we're loaded up with some sort of verb and we click on an empty item slot, it will reset everything and go back to square one. Now for the onHovered, we can copy and paste the hasItem again, because only if an item is in the slot will the onHover even fire. So for the true, again, we're going to add a comment that just says mouse enter item that we will figure out in a bit. And we can get that adventure controller again. And we'll add a reroute node because these are both going to be performed on the adventure controller. And if it's false, obviously nothing's going to happen. And the same thing goes for the unhovered. If it's true, then we're going to say the mouse exits an item. And if it's false, nothing's going to happen. Now with all of that set up, we just need to go to the adventure controller and figure out the functions and events that will fill in the voids. So if we drag everything down on the event graph in the adventure controller under the left mouse button event, we can add a new custom event called item clicked. And then what we can do is go back to the item slot and we'll just throw in the item clicked event here and link that up. And then head back to the adventure controller. And we'll add the functions for the mouse enter hotspot and mouse exit hotspot. And we'll call the first function mouse enter inventory item. And we'll add an input variable that will be of the type item slot, not BP item. And we're going to call it item slot. Then we'll make another function called mouse exit inventory item. And we don't need an input variable at all. So now we can actually set up the remaining two functions on the item slot widget. So if you drag out from the adventure controller, we can find the mouse enter inventory item, and for the item slot, we can pass in a reference to self. And then for the mouse exit item, it's just the mouse exit inventory item function, and you can hook that up to the true branch. And make sure you compile and save, and you can close that. Now, back in the adventure controller, in the event graph, let's fill in the item clicked event. And what we'll do first is create a macro that we'll call perform item interaction. And much like the hotspot interaction, this is going to determine what verb is being used and fire the corresponding function on the BP item. So if we do a switch on verb used, we can drag in the active verb and hook that up to the selection. But we'll need a reference to the actual item slot. So if we make a new variable and call it target inventory slot and set it to the type WBP underscore item slot, then we can use this reference to find the item. So get inventory item, and then from the item, we can fire each of the verb interaction events. So starting with on look at, and the next one we can do on open. And we can hook the on open function to the open verb, and the on look at function actually can be connected to both the walk to verb and the look at verb, because again, we won't be walking to our inventory items. And then for the give verb, we're going to, again, do this later. So we'll just say that it will print a string called need give logic. And then we can hook up all of the remaining verb interaction functions. And also for the use verb, we will be doing another print string that says need use logic. And then I like to select all of the nodes and distribute vertically and then align left, just to clean things up. Now in the mouse enter inventory item function, we can take the hotspot interaction bool and then the is performing task interaction bool, and we're going to check if either of these are true. So we'll use the or node and then branch from that. And then we can drag in the target inventory slot and set that to be the item slot variable that we pass through. And that can be connected to the false output of the branch. And then we will call the update interaction text at the end. And now for the mouse exit inventory item, we will again do the same checks as the mouse enter, so you can copy that branch and paste it in here. And if it's false, we're going to set the target inventory slot to nothing. And then we will update the interaction text again. All right. Now we mustn't forget to perform the item interaction right after the item clicked event is fired. And now we can clean this up a little bit too. And compile and save. Now, in the adventure instance, we're going to add a variable, and it's going to be called inventory, and it's going to be an array of BP items. So if you make it the type of BP item, you can click the circle on the right side and change it to that grid pattern array. and compile and save. And we will use this later, but this is where the inventory of the player will be stored. Now let's go to the widgets, and we're going to open the inventory widget. And in here, we're going to change each of these images to store our inventory slot widgets. So what we want to do is wrap each image with an overlay, and we're going to rename the overlay the corresponding name, but we will call it top item overlay 1. So each one will be the corresponding, top item overlay 2, top item overlay 3, etc. So now we want to drag the item slot over top of the overlay, and it will put it below the BG image. And then we want to do this for each one of these slots. So again, for the second one, we'll wrap it with the overlay, and then make sure you drag the item slot on top of the overlay, and make sure that you rename the overlay to something like top item overlay 2. And make sure you do that for each of these, including the bottom item row. Now with that done, we also need to rename the item slots. So I like to name each one just the base name. So the top item 1 is just called top item 1, top item 2, and etc. And I think that's going to do it for this episode. We're at about 47 minutes long. So the next video is also going to be long, but it's going to be more blueprints and math and confusion. So I want to be able to take some time and really kind of explain the process that I'll be going through. So we'll leave that for another video. Please like and subscribe or hit that bell icon to be notified when I upload new videos. And I will see you on Inventory Part 2.